So this is part 4. And so the first thing to be aware of is that there have been a set of laws based on the Belmont Report. In the Belmont Report you learned about in the last section that apply to research conducted, supported, or regulated by the federal government. And these laws mandate, in particular, an institutional review board to make sure that everyone follows research protocols and scouts out potential ethical problems. So this IRB is every place that conducts research. Every institution at which research is conducted needs to have this review board. We have one here at Diné College, and there are some guidelines for who needs to be on the institutional review board. 2 or 3 year terms, but members can stay longer. And members have to be diverse. Like, we can't have the members who are all people who think the way we do. We need to have different perspectives. So first off, we need to have people who are qualified through experience, expertise, and diversity, as I just said. So 5 people at least. That's our quorum here at Diné College. You have to have men and women, both represented. You have to have people representing different professions. So we can't have everybody just in psychology. We need to have some people in other social sciences, maybe someone in education, someone in the sciences, the biological sciences. And then we need to have someone who's not from a scientific discipline to take on the understanding of how other non-scientists would perceive this work or the ethical violations. And we don't want to get caught in sort of like institutional agreement or groupthink. And so we have to have someone who's not even affiliated with the institution. And they all have to be qualified, so able to review research involving vulnerable subjects. And they can't have a conflict of interest. That is, they can't be paid to, say, be a part of it. Or if I am proposing research, I can't be part of the committee reviewing my own research. So that's what we mean by that. So it's independent of the research, and primarily the goal is to protect the rights and welfare of human subjects. So here at Diné College, I've been the chair for about a year now, and we do have a really nice diverse membership. We actually want to include a student representative as well, someone who's had their research class and is familiar with this, because we think that would be a good perspective to hear from. We don't have one right now. And then for here on the Navajo Nation, there are even extra protections. So there has to be a separate IRB for the Navajo Nation, and that's a different process. And anyone who's a faculty at Diné College has to also go through the Navajo Nation IRB, or RRB, they call the Research Review Board. And students don't need to go through that process, but because the faculty is presumed to be able to make those judgments. So then the APA Ethics Code, so this is specifically related to psychology. And this is specifically what they say in Standard 8. That first off, there has to be informed consent, and it has to be in writing and signed. So there has to be something people signed. So they have to be informed of their rights. We'll look at that more in a minute. If there is deception, such as that we discussed in the Milgram study, for example, it has to be justified by possible benefits, and it has to cause minimal risk to participants. Debriefing must fully explain, assess, and treat any possible psychological stress that's endured, or of course physical stress. Non-human animal subjects, separate procedures are in place for non-human animal subjects. We don't yet have this process here at Diné College, so approval for that sort of work would have to take place elsewhere. And then scholarly integrity just means that you want to retain the confidentiality of your participants, but you can't just hide your data and say no one else can see it. And the reason for that is that others have to be able to understand that you're evaluating those data accurately. And so we have to share or have, at least with quantitative data, we have to have what's called transparency so that other people can see your data and agree that you've drawn the right conclusions and done the right analyses. So who is protected? So interestingly, living individuals are all protected. So any living individuals, but also if the data originate from living people. So like if you're asked to give biospecimens, your saliva to test for cortisol, or urine to look for blood sugar, or blood to look for some maybe biological indicator, anything like that that you provide is also protected by the IRB. If those same data originate from non-living people, then the guidelines are a little bit different. And our IRB at Diné College is currently working on understanding and implementing protections for biospecimens. Dr. Hakim at Tuba City campus is doing some very, very fine work, and so we're really trying to expedite this process to make her work more viable. And so the types of study that are addressed by the IRB, so anything that involves some sort of an intervention. So by that we mean a treatment like a medication, or also like in psychology, well, what Milgram did, for example, making people believe that they were shocking, or what Zimbardo did, randomly assigning students to be either prisoners or guards. And less famous examples too, some of the other examples that we've looked at in our study. If something is done to people, then there has to be IRB. If there is, even if the study just involves interaction with people, like you're communicating with someone via in person, by phone, by email, by video conference, even by online survey, that's considered communication, any of those have to go through the IRB. And finally, if there's any identifiable private information, and private information is anything about you. It just means that if we can figure out who you are, even if the information you provide is innocuous, it's not important, then we need to have IRB approval. So this is really about protecting participants' rights. So what needs to be in this informed consent document? So you'll be writing one of these for your study. So subjects have to be informed of everything that might influence their decision of whether they want to participate. So they must be told, every informed consent has to include what they'll be doing during the study and how long it will take. It has to include the purpose of the study, including the benefits to the individual themselves and like to science and society, those things we've talked about earlier. The researcher does not have to reveal the full hypothesis and the literature view, the thinking foundation of the study. And in some cases, revealing the hypothesis would be detrimental to the study. So that doesn't have to be included. And we'll talk more about deception shortly. The potential risks of participation. So the work that you are developing, you probably think has minimal risks. Nothing going on here. What if someone listens to music while they're making art? So what? What if someone completes a survey about Canalda? So what? You might be thinking that. But every study has some potential risks. So you will be asked to evaluate potential risks of participation and to really think creatively, like think of isolated cases. Is there anyone who might be harmed by participating in the work that you're doing? Participants have to be informed of the right to withdraw at any time. So they can leave your study right in the middle if they want to. And then privacy and confidentiality is the main other aspect that needs to be revealed to participants that might impact whether they want to participate. So private information gained during the study must be anonymous if that's possible. And by anonymous, we just mean nobody knows who they are. So their identity is completely, nobody's aware of their identity. And confidential means that, okay, the researchers do gather information about who's participating, but they keep it locked up in a secure server, and they don't ever keep the data together with the name of the person providing the data. So privacy, a little bit more. Think about these issues. These are things the IRB has to think about. Is it an invasion of privacy if people are videotaped against their knowledge? So you're interested in people's, this is the example I gave in class recently, you're interested in people's hand washing behavior. To what extent do people wash their hands after using a public restroom? And so you put up a little camera in the bathroom. That doesn't capture like them actually using the toilet, so not that sort of thing, but it captures their sink behavior. Is that an invasion of privacy? What if you're observing people in public places? You're interested in mask wearing behavior, and so you sit down at the entrance to a Walmart and you take notes on the number of people wearing masks as they enter the Walmart. Or you're in a bar, you want to know about people's dating behavior, and so you just sit in the bar and you observe people as they get together and meet other people. What if you are conducting secret observations, but nothing embarrassing or illegal occurs? An example of this is a study that was done. The purpose of the study was justified, but it was filming actually in hotel rooms, and nothing embarrassing, nothing illegal occurred the way this filming was done. Nothing was videotaped that could be embarrassing or illegal. But is that an invasion of privacy? Here's the specific example. What if there's a bar and you don't actually sit in the bar and take notes, but there's a security camera in the bar, and you get together with the bar owner and say, hey, could I use the videos that you're taking in your bar to gather data on courtship behaviors of men and women? Is that an invasion of privacy? What about, again, going back to this hand washing thing, what if you're observing embarrassing behaviors? Like what if you didn't wash your hands after you went to the bathroom one time in a public bathroom, you were just kind of late, and then you discover that someone has observed this either through camera or in some way, but they'll never know who you are, they'll never know your identity. Is that an invasion of privacy? So typically, whether anything that could potentially be an invasion of privacy is allowed is based on a cost-benefit analysis. What are the risks and what are the benefits? And if the benefits are very great, like, for example, it might be very important to understand people's hand washing behavior at a time of a pandemic, like early on when we thought that the primary transmission was through say, contact. That might be a real big benefit to health if we understand people's hand washing behavior, because then we can really implement interventions maybe. So let's say there's a big benefit and the cost is minimal in that you're not ever going to know people's identities, and you're not going to record any like unclothed or using the actual facility kind of behavior. So most researchers would consider all of these, though, to be an invasion of privacy, except number 2, sitting in the entry to the Walmart observing people. So yeah, these are difficult decisions the IRB has to make. So next we have to think about vulnerable populations. So some of the examples, remember, used very vulnerable. Remember the study that used orphan children? Double vulnerability. They're children, they have no advocates, and they're orphans, so emotionally vulnerable. So there are extra protections in place. So any populations that may be less capable of understanding or advocating for their own rights are protected by federal regulations. And these include children, people with mental illness or intellectual challenges, prisoners, targeted minority populations, like if they specifically decided to just use Navajo people. Well, in that case, Navajo people there would have to be a great deal of justification for why they're making that choice. And that base, you can remember the Tuskegee syphilis study when the participants were Black people, Black males in particular. And so nowadays that wouldn't be acceptable. They would have to justify why they're doing that. But you may recall that during the COVID testing of vaccinations, many Navajo people were afraid to participate because they had the sense that maybe they were being targeted, that maybe the US government was trying to try out this dangerous vaccine on them in order to harm them. And so once you, as a researcher or researchers previous to you, violate a population, like by taking advantage in the way that happened in the Tuskegee prison study, it would take extra effort, generations and generations, to counteract the distrust that emerges from that sort of thing. And that's when we saw when the Navajo people hesitated to participate in many Navajo people hesitated to participate in the vaccine trials because of previous experiences of distrust. Fetuses are protected, so pregnant women is often how we think about that. And people who may be suicidal, also vulnerable populations. And this is not a finite list. There are other populations that would also have special protections. And so there's a lot of extra work that individuals have to do if they wish to work with any of these special populations. So some populations are not officially considered vulnerable. That is, they're not like legally mandated to have special protections, but they're generally addressed anyhow in the IRB because of power differences. And what about this? You have a really well-funded study, and the study is interested in people who are poor. So there's a power difference. You have individuals with a lot of money working with people who need money. And so then those poor people could be manipulated by getting, say, compensation that's really high. They might be motivated. If you're very hungry, you might take risks, long-term risks, in order to get food in this moment. That's what this states. If the compensation is too large, the participants, the poor people, might become involved because, dang, they need to pay the rent or they need to get groceries. And so this would be examined by the IRB to make sure that the compensation was not giving undue influence. There was a medical study that my daughter participated in when she was in college. I did not want her to, but they paid, and she was in college around 2005, I believe. 2006 is when she did this, and at that time they paid her $1,500 to come to this lab. She could do all her work and stuff. She just needed to come to this lab for a few days, and they were going to give her a medicine to try it out to understand the side effects. And for her, as a college student, she was poor, and the study was well funded, and $1,500 was a big motivation for her. And so, nothing seems to have come of it, but that was a pretty vulnerable situation for her. So professors and college students. So we don't think of college students as being a vulnerable population. You're smart, very capable individuals. However, when there's a power dynamic at play, like if you're a professor and the person who's giving you grades and determining whether you get your degree, that's a lot of power. And so compensation by grades or something like that would make these college students, well, we need to protect you. So we look at, I can't remember if I wrote the point down, so I'll state it here, but it might come up in print. If a professor is doing a study and they need to use college students as participants in the study, first off, no professor can recruit his or her own students. So someone else would have to step in and do any recruiting for this study. Secondly, if this professor is giving grades like extra credit to participate in the study, which often happens, they always have to provide an alternate way to earn that same extra credit, because otherwise the extra credit becomes an undue influence on a student who needs to improve their grades. And this is just what I said here. I couldn't remember if I had written it. So those are just some examples of power dynamics. If a doctor, a trusted doctor, cancer doctor, for example, wants their cancer patients to try out a new medication, that would be another example of a power dynamic. So the doctor is the expert, and people who trust their expertise are vulnerable. And so once again, we look carefully at that kind of power dynamic. Doctors, employers, if your employer wants you to participate, if a police officer, your parole officer, something like that. All of those would be power dynamics that we'd investigate. Now, a way that I've conducted research is using Amazon Mechanical Turk, MTurk. We talked about this in your section on selecting or recruiting participants, I believe. And as you know, this is a process which anyone, could sign up as a worker. And in order to earn money, you'd participate in surveys and you'd get cash. They'd pay you. And usually it's just surveys. But the problem is that compensation is often minimal and surveys can be long. And so is it ethical to use MTurk for the researcher's perspective? If the amount that I'm paying, let's say I'm going to have them do a 30-minute survey and I only have enough money to give each participant for their 30 minutes, I think $5 would be pretty big compensation, So they're receiving less than minimum wage. Is that ethical? I mean, I'm not forcing anyone, right? People sign up to be a worker of their own accord. I tell them in advance the survey is going to take 30 minutes. If they agree to do it, is that my problem? That's the kind of thing that the researcher might do. And the researchers, for their side, if it's an unfunded researcher, if it's you, for example, doing the research, you might not have a lot of money to compensate people. And so it's always like a balancing act that the researcher is doing. And then finally, this idea of deception. So you knew in the Milgram study, they did not tell participants what the study was. They told them it was a memory task. That's called deception. And deception is the intentional misleading of subjects or the withholding of full information about the nature of the experiment. And that is during the informed consent process. So you're actually not telling the individuals what the study is about. You might need to do it. The Milgram study could never have been conducted if Milgram had said, this is a fake shocking system, and the person who's screaming behind there is not real. He's not really in pain. What we're interested in knowing is, if I tell you to shock them to death, will you actually do it? As soon as you tell people, you can no longer study it. And so this is a problem with a lot of psychology studies. It interferes with the ability of the participant to give informed consent, but sometimes it's necessary. So how does the IRB decide whether to allow it? So first off, the researcher has to justify that deception is necessary. And this approval would be contingent on the cost-benefit analysis. The benefits of this research study must outweigh the risks, and that relates to the importance of the study. The risk has to be minimal. So if the deception would cause the participants to, say, walk out in front of traffic and possibly get harmed, no way that would be approved. If the risk is minimal, participants might experience temporary distress. Maybe it would be allowed if it's important enough. So the risk can't be impacted by the deception. The risk can't be made greater by the fact that the deception is going to happen. And then finally, this idea of debriefing. Participants have to be debriefed after the study, and if I'm remembering correctly, that's coming up on my next slide. And incidentally, you'll see this in one of your quiz questions. When you ask participants how they feel about deception in research, typically they believe that deception is sometimes necessary in research. So that's the common belief, that they're not that bothered by it. And in fact, the aspect of the study that people are usually most bothered in are if like whoever's checking them in to participate isn't kind or courteous. Like that's the kind of thing that seems to bother them most. People seem to generally understand what's going on after the debriefing. But a little more at debriefing. Debriefing is a meeting or interview or conversation with each participant, either in a group like this or individually, depending on the nature of the experiment, right after it, in order to first make sure that you understand what happened and why they were deceived. So every forthright honesty, this would be scripted so that everyone is getting the same information. And then there would be a check, probing in many ways to see whether these individuals are okay. This may include like a questionnaire, but more likely includes an interview, so that individuals who might not be okay can, many different ways to get them to reveal that, and then providing competent support if any individuals are in fact distressed. So I was working in an EEG lab, and that is a lab where individuals put a cap on that has electrodes that measure electrical activity in their brain, and then they're asked to do a number of tasks. And the researcher was studying depression, and there are some indicators of depression related to which of these electrodes are active in typical people. So afterwards, the graduate assistant, who is a doctoral student in psychology, would interview each person who participated. And during that interview process, if somebody needed counseling, that would be provided right away by these trained doctoral students who are involved in this research. Sometimes the competent support is the referral to an outside source. So if it was you conducting the study and you did a debriefing afterwards, you might not have someone skillful right there. So perhaps you would contact somebody like Dr. Begay or Dr. Barba, for example, both of whom are trained practicing counselors. And maybe they would agree to provide support if anyone is distressed, if they supported your work. Or maybe you would refer them to a hotline of some sort where they could get support if they were distressed. So, brief summary. Participants' right includes informed consent, the right to withdraw, anonymity, and confidentiality. And other protections include these special protections for vulnerable populations, the use of deception only under particular circumstances, and appropriate compensation that does not exert undue influence.